Through fandom, I actually learned a lot about myself, my being queer and like gender and sexuality and all that stuff. That's sort of how I got to know who I was. So if I like wanted to make people feel included the way I was feeling included, I wanted to start making comics myself that already had those themes that were a part of it instead of having to like sort of scour and project onto things that already existed. If I were to point fingers at any piece of media, I would have to say Evangelion. I had a friend who was interested in it. We were sort of like passively consuming it, but we sort of fed off of each other in a way that I hadn't experienced before. I feel like before I had used books and media to isolate in a way, and Evangelion was my like first step into engaging with other people and connecting with them through a story. I really related personally to the main character, Shinji. I was 14 when I entered that fandom, and there was something about him that I hadn't seen in other characters. And I think being able to sort of reflect myself in him made me interested in creating characters that other people might see themselves in and feel represented through. Also, like the experience that you have as a queer person in fandom is different than it might be for others, or even any sort of marginalized group of people. In fandom, you can sort of project who you are onto the characters you love. When it comes to like characters that people are very passionate about, they always have, headcanons or like ways that they see a character and the ways that they think that character should be depicted. I see it especially with books, like prose books, as opposed to shows and comics where the characters are already like sort of visually represented. But with actual prose where half of it is your imagination, people can get very defensive about the way that they've imagined a character to be. I'm a big fan of Stephen King. I joined the It fandom a few years back. There was a very ambiguous, could like blink and you miss it, queer character in Richie. And most people probably didn't read him as gay in the novels, but if you were queer when you were reading them, there were subtle parts of his character that I think any queer person would see and be like, I kind of see myself in that. In the movies, 2017 or 2019 movies, they canonically made him gay. So I've definitely seen interpretations of characters that were like not maybe intentionally the way that the author had written them, but were interpreted that way. And that is a big case where like the actual mainstream movie publisher decided to like make that canonical. So that's a more positive side of things. I have seen like in every fandom there's some weird takes on characters where like people will lean into stereotypes and you're like, the original kind of had more nuance. So can we back to that? With every character, I think you have to see the way that people interpret them. And whether you're agreeing or disagreeing, you are learning more about them with the act of disagreeing. You're saying, I reject that part of them. So that's definitely not them. And you have a better understanding of who they were in your head. The personality for me of a character is first and foremost. It's the first thing I think of. And I'm definitely influenced by different characters in media that already exist. But I do see gaps in like mainstream media, especially when I was growing up. Things are different now. But when I was in high school, we didn't really have Steven Universe or Cora or any of those things where you would have explicit queer representation. So for me, my goal was to fill those gaps and make sure that young people who were like me had people that they could relate to in the stories that they loved. I did a short little comic about two girls who were investigating this old house with ghosts. And it was queer and funny, but also had, spooky elements. And one day, Boom approached me. I think it was like a year out of school or maybe right after I graduated. they approached me to see if I had anything that they wanted to like expand into a graphic novel. Obviously, as a creator, I am really big into fandom. I feel like fandom definitely inspired my career in general. I think that my creating fan art for various stories made me realize that people are interested in what I'm doing, how I'm like representing these characters, how I could represent my own. They liked and responded to my art, which was something that I hadn't really gotten before. And I guess, I mean, obviously, I learned a lot about the queer community through fandom. I learned a lot about gender and sexuality. And through seeing characters that I loved represented in those terms, I feel like it opened doors for me that had been previously closed. Given time, I would have understood at least some aspects of myself. I definitely think I would have known eventually that I was bisexual, but what bisexual meant to me, I think, would have been different. Like the different ways that you can be bisexual, especially gender. I feel like fandom really opened my eyes with how gender is represented. It's so rarely covered, like, especially for non binary folk. There's not a whole lot of representation in mainstream media. So having people who have experienced these things showing like their experiences and helping guide other people into understanding those things more opened up so many different avenues of exploration. I have had discussions with people where we talked about how they discovered what it means to be non binary, or not even what it means, but to make them curious, I guess is the word. I think that it's such a broad spectrum, it's hard to distill into one definition. So the way that I do it is I just have characters that I believe are lovable and interesting and relatable, and I have them be whatever sexuality or gender they are, and people can either see themselves in that or not. Having the opportunity to explore on their own, which I think is really important, instead of being told like what you are, the journey of discovery is probably the most important part. Opening up the conversation, I think, is my biggest goal when it comes to like representation. When I was young and learning things about myself, I think part of the reason why I took fandom to get me to understand myself was because all of the definitions I heard about what it means to be interested in women or like bisexual, those were all things that were very narrow. And I didn't see myself in the characters that were labeled as such in the media that I'd been consuming. It took people from the actual communities giving their perspectives for me to understand that I was seeing myself. I know that fandom can be a strange place sometimes, but it's curated by you. You don't need to engage with anyone that makes you unhappy. The block button is there for a reason. Use it, and fandom can also just be you and one other person. So make it as small and intimate as you want. The biggest thing is just to have fun. Um, you're there because you love these characters. So